We'll be back with our exceptional, indefatigable guide, Julien Savadoux, who's going to be taking us on a live stroll of one of my favorite neighborhoods and probably one of yours, the Marais in central Paris. My name is Ellen McBreen. I am the founder of Paris Muse, and I am joined today by Vera, our general manager. And as always, we are happy to see you. We are going to ask that if you have any questions during the walk, that you put them in the chat. And when there's a moment, I will relay them to Julien, and we will try to make some time for posing those questions to Julien. Just by way of introduction, for those of you who are joining us for the very first time, Julien is a native Parisian. He is a guide for Paris Muse, both our in-person tours and for our Muse+Connect online programming that we started a few months ago. He has just come, in fact, from giving an in-person private tour at the Louvre, Hidden Masterpieces. So we're happy to report that, we're back doing live tours, not maybe in the numbers that we were doing, of course, last summer. But as you know, the museums are open, and you'll see today, the streets are full. Obviously, people are still cautious, but we're seeing signs of life, and we're really happy to be helping people to enjoy those signs of life. Julien is a real expert in the Marais. He is a guide for many of our Paris Muse tours, but today the material that he'll be sharing with you and the knowledge that he'll be sharing with you is really based on years of guiding in this wonderful historic neighborhood. And so today's program is adapted from an in-person tour that Julien and many of our guides give, which is called the Marais March to Magnificence. And as a sort of exciting preview, he'll be also leading us to the Hôtel de Lauzun, which is not a very known hôtel particulier. Most of the things that we're going to be looking at today with Julien are known in French as hôtel particulier, which just means private residence, private mansion. And this one is, in fact, owned in part by the city of Paris. Its interiors are really exceptional. They have some of the most well-preserved kind of woodwork from the age of Louis XIV. And so Julien is going to, hopefully, if we have time, end there at the facade. And he is developing this as a live tour. So we're really looking forward to offering that on special dates starting in either late September or October. Julien is someone who, studied art and art history at the Sorbonne. His degree is in cultural mediation. And he has been kind of guiding visitors to his favorite spots in and around Paris for decades. If those of you who, have joined some of our free meetups before, you know that, he took us through Mont Saint-Michel. And he is someone who really exemplifies the quote that he has in our online bio. It's a Hegel quote, which is, "Nothing in the world has ever been done without passion." And I would say, when I think of Julien, sort of passion is probably the first word that comes to mind. The second one is energy, as you'll see today. So without further ado, I do want to ask Julien to come on. Again, Vera is going to be placing links in the chat in case you wanted to explore a little bit more, but really feel free to pose your questions, and we will have time to share them with Julien. Julian, it's always lovely to see your face
Hi,
in
Ellen.
this case, in my old neighborhood, which I miss so
Oh,
much.
yeah.
Good afternoon. So where are you going to take
Good
us today,
afternoon.
Julian?
So yeah, hi everyone. This is Julien live from Paris. Thank you for joining me on this tour in the Marais. As you said, Ellen, one of the most historic, one of the most emblematic, iconic neighborhoods in Paris. And I want to take you through some interesting spots in the Marais. I want to show you especially two mansions. One that just reopened. It's a fabulous museum, and I want to say a few words about it. A museum on the history of Paris. And at the end of the tour, and I'm sure we'll get there, I want to take you to another beautiful private mansion, which is located on Ile Saint-Louis, Island Saint Louis, because we have two islands in the heart of Paris, in the center of Paris. Ile de la Cité, the city island, where the famous Notre Dame Cathedral stands, still standing. Reconstruction works resumed at the cathedral not long ago. And there's a second island where I want to take you, a beautiful island that was artificially created, actually. I'll say, of course, a few words when I get there. And there's beautiful private mansions that were built over that very famous island in the heart of Paris. So I'm standing right here in this tiny street. So let me turn the camera back onto the city, because really the star is the city today, the Marais. Yes, excellent. So this tiny street in the Marais, which is a funny name, maybe you're probably wondering what the origin of the word Marais is in French, and not everybody, even in France, is familiar with the fact that the Marais was originally a swamp. Marais means marsh, really, if I translate it literally into English. It's Marais, it has the same origin, the word Marais and marsh in English. And it was a swamp for long until the 1100s, and in the 1200s, religious congregations, religious people decided to move to the area, drain the swamp, and start cultures, fields where they grew vegetables and fruit, orchards. And basically, if you walk through the Marais, you will see that some of the streets are named after those cultures laid by the religious orders, the religious congregations that settled here in the Middle Ages. Then the area became royal, if I might say. It became royal with King Charles V, who decided to build a beautiful mansion. It was St. Paul Mansion, where he loved spending time. And so because the king loved spending time here in the Marais, many aristocratic families, the wealthy families that revolved around the king at court, decided to move into the neighborhood and started building beautiful mansions. And the Marais was the most sought after residential area in Paris until the end of the 17th century. It all changed with Louis XIV, who decided to move to Versailles. The Louvre was the main residence in Paris, and Louis XIV didn't like Paris so much. Louis XIV decided to leave Paris behind, settled in Versailles. And so it's in the 1680s, when royal court moved from Paris to Versailles, that families decided to start settling in other areas in Paris. I'm thinking Western Paris, because those areas were closer to Versailles when they had to get to Versailles with a carriage. It was easier to be in Western Paris, closer to Royal Versailles, the new seat of royal power. So the Marais really was, again, that prized area until yes, I'd say beginning of the 18th century. Families lived here. All throughout the 19th century, the neighborhood went derelict. It was actually in a bad state of complete disrepair at the beginning of the 20th century. Private mansions were turned into manufacturers. New people moved into the area. I'm thinking of a new influx of people coming from Eastern Europe, and a growing Jewish community fleeing the persecutions in Eastern Europe, moved in at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. So giving a new twist to the area. It was really from the 1980s, starting in the 1980s, that the Marais, the area made a comeback with lots of artists that settled here. They took over the old workshops. They took over the old private mansions and old apartments. Rents were very low back in the 1980s. And so the Marais really began to pick up again with Parisians, I'd say 20 years ago and 30 years ago. And the irony of the Marais, the story is very ironical because now the Marais is probably the most expensive in terms of real estate. It's probably the most expensive area in Paris to live in terms of the price per square meter. That's how we calculate real estate prices here in Paris. And the price of square meter in the Marais skyrocketed in the past few years. We're talking maybe between 10 and 15,000 euros or $15,000 a square meter in the Marais for depending, of course, on the area of the Marais. Some parts of some pockets in the Marais are more expensive than others. I'm actually just wanted to give you this introduction here. I'm standing right here because the first spot I want to show you is no private mention. It's one of my favorite spots to have lunch or coffee. It's called Le Loir dans la théière. It means the dormouse in the teapot. It has a funny name. It's a great coffee shop. It's a great place for tea, coffee. It has amazing pastries. You really need, I can't go inside with my camera. They won't let me in. But really, it's a great way to start a tour of the Marais. I'd come here in the afternoon really because it can be pretty quiet in the morning. I mean, shops are open from 10 in the morning, but I really come here, have a lunch, or even if you have lunch somewhere, grab a coffee and a pastry at the dormouse in the teapot, and then stroll around the area where what I will do with you right now. Actually, we could have had coffee together or tea together at the dormouse. And start our walk from here. Of course, Ellen, if you have questions during the tour as I'm walking, feel free, or if anyone has a question in the box for me, I can answer while I'm walking to my next spot, because I want to take you to a beautiful private mansion. And I want to say a word about private mansion, by the way, because private mansion, you said it right, Ellen, the word in French is hôtel particulier. So it means a particular hotel or a private hotel. What does it mean? Those mansions were built by aristocratic families, wealthy families in what we call the old regime in France, at a time when France was a monarchy. It was a kingdom, and so society was divided into different categories. And you had a certain category in population called the aristocracy. They had certain privileges. Obviously, they were the wealthy families, even if not all noble families or aristocratic families were super wealthy, but most of them were. And it also meant that aristocratic families took their wealth, or their wealth was based on the amount of land they owned in the countryside. And so it means that their main estate was somewhere in the countryside. Land was given to them, or land had been given to them by former kings of the Middle Ages. That's how they got so wealthy and so important. And so basically they had their estates in the countryside. And of course, they wanted to come to Paris to visit the king in Paris. And they had to stay somewhere in Paris. There were no hotels as we know them now. And the word hotel comes from there. They were staying in their private hotels, which was their temporary residence in Paris while visiting the king in Paris, the seat of royal power. And so I wanted to take you inside this beautiful courtyard. It's Hôtel de Lauzun. So they're all named. Usually you find the word hotel, then the DE is the marker of nobility. So it precedes the name of the aristocratic family. Here, obviously, the name is Lamoignon. Difficult name, probably, to pronounce Lamoignon. So it's the courtyard, and all private mansions were built the same way. Most of them were built from the beginning of the 1600s. And then the last private mansion that was built in the Marais was built at the beginning of the 1700s. The very first private mansion, I will take you next, was built in the 1550s. But that was the 1550s, the mansions that we still have. Mansions that we still have, because I told you that it's true that in the Middle Ages, families moved to be closer to Charles V in the 14th century, but they lived in smaller houses. Most of them were destroyed, were knocked down. Because they were smaller, because they were old and crumbling down. And so the mansions were replaced during what we call the Great Century in France, the 17th century, the century of Louis XIV. And those mansions were replaced and rebuilt by the most famous architects in France. And I'm thinking of a few names, François Mansart, it's probably the most famous name in French architecture, in the history of French architecture. Louis Levaux, and we'll be talking about Louis Levaux. He's the one who designed Versailles for Louis XIV. He built private mansions in the Marais and on Island St. Louis. In Lamoignon, it's interesting because I told you that many of those mansions were turned into manufactures during the 19th century, workshops. Many of them were damaged, actually, because they were not built and fit for the industry or industrial activity, industrial workshops. And so some of them were damaged and they had to be restored to their past glory. It was really in the 1960s that the whole area was preserved, thanks to a man, his name is Andrew Malraux. He was Minister of Culture for Charles de Gaulle, and he's the one who decided to save the Marais. Because many promoters thought, oh, the Marais is in a very bad state of disrepair, it's crumbling down, we should just knock it down altogether and rebuild a modern neighborhood. And that was the idea in the 1960s. And André Malraux really thought that it would be an outrage. He was outraged by the idea of tearing down such a historic place. And so he put the whole area, it was one of the first areas to be written as a historic site. It was put on preserved list, conservation list, as we call it here in France, une aire de conservation, and un quartier préservé, conservé. And so many of those mansions were turned into cultural institutions. And for example, Hôtel de Lauzun was made a library. It's a public library, and it's the library for the history of Paris. So many students in history at the Sorbonne or even art history, they come here to Lamoignon, which has a great collection of books on the history of Paris and its region. And so yes, I was about to explain that the courtyard, you get into the courtyard, you get to the main building, the mansion, the private mansion, and then behind the mansion, you find a garden. And that's how it works most of the time. The street is very busy here because it's one of the main thoroughfares in the Marais, Rue des Francs-Bourgeois. And so you see it gets very busy because people are actually coming here for shopping. The Marais is a great place for shopping. The Marais is a microcosm in Paris, really, meaning that it is, I'd say, sort of, it summarizes all Paris, what Paris is all about. It has the private mansions, it has the museums, it has the restaurants, it has the cafes, it has the shopping. So really, you could spend a whole week in the Marais and not see everything, because it's probably one of the richest neighborhoods in Paris in terms of culture and in terms of history. They have a cafe now in the garden. So this is a beautiful private mansion. It's Carnavalet mansion. You can see, maybe I can just a tiny bit. The Carnavalet mansion closed for a long time, actually. I think it closed for more than 4 or 5 years. And the Carnavalet mansion was built in the 1550s, 1560s. It was one of the first mansions to be built in the Marais for a parliamentary of Paris, a lawyer would say today. It was his name was Jacques de Ligneris. Just a quick look at the garden behind the Lamoignon. So these gardens, some of them are turned into squares where people can go, or little tiny parks. People go sit on a bench. They go with a drink, or they go sit and talk. So all mansions have a garden or a backyard, which is actually a garden. I will show you more during the tour. The Carnavalet, and I want to get back to the Carnavalet Museum because it's really a fantastic museum. So it goes down for refurbishment, renovation. It's a huge museum. Yes, huge. Not as huge as the Louvre, obviously, but it's a pretty big museum, and it is the Museum on the History of Paris. It's actually Haussmann who decided to make it the Museum for the History of Paris in the 19th century. I don't know if you ever heard about Haussmann. We have a tour with Paris Muse. We created a tour, Making Modern Paris, which focuses on the transformation of Paris in the 19th century. And the man in charge, the head of project today, we said the head of project for the transformation of Paris was George Eugene Haussmann. And he's really the one man that made Paris that made the city looks like what it does look like today. Half of the city was rebuilt by Haussmann. So he's the one. He left his mark here at the Carnavalet Museum as well. He's the one who decided to make the Carnavalet mansion, because of course it used to be a private mansion owned by a private family, the family of the parliamentary, the lawyer. Why the name Carnavalet? Because you could ask me, but you said his name was Jacques de Ligneris. So it could have been the Ligneris mansion, but the mansion took the name of the following resident, the person that followed, who came from Brittany. The name was Carnavalet, which is also almost impossible to say for a French person. And because Parisians couldn't pronounce the name correctly, they turned it into Carnavalet. Carnavalet was easier to say than Carnavalet. So it became the Carnavalet mansion, and it became famous not because of the first resident who built the mansion, not because of the second resident that gave it its name. It became famous because of a woman that lived here. She's Madame de Sévigné, and she's the most famous female writer in French history, because we didn't have, at the time, it was not common for women to be writers. And so Madame de Sévigné went down in French history as a great literary figure, a great writer. She left us thousands of letters, and they're great testimonies on life in the 17th century, life at court, because of course she would spend time at court in Versailles. So Madame de Sévigné is great if you're interested in Louis XIV reign, and if you're interested in France in the 17th century. Madame de Sévigné is a great author to read for that purpose. So I hope you can still hear me. Are we good? Ellen or Vera, are you there?
We're here, Julien. We hear you great. It's wonderful.
Ah, excellent. Rue des Francs-Bourgeois, yes, as I told you, is famous for shopping. A lot of perfume shops. If you're into cosmetics and perfumes, that's the street, because all big names in the cosmetic industry and the perfume industry, they all have their stores, shops on Rue des Francs-Bourgeois. Again, one of the main thoroughfares. The Marais is also very popular among Parisians because it's one of the few areas in Paris where shops are open on Sundays. And so today, Saturday, is pretty busy, as you can see. People turn to the streets. We're trying to get back to normal life after or during the COVID pandemic. We're still going through the COVID pandemic, but you don't see people wearing masks. Huh? Just a few words about the pandemic, because the French government decided to allow people to walk freely in the streets without masks on. We need to wear our masks inside shops. Going into cafes, you will have to wear your mask until you're seated. And then once you're seated, once you're at your table, obviously you can remove your mask for your drink, for your lunch, or for your dinner. So again, a great place to come to here. The street, the Francs-Bourgeois, is actually a great way to get to one of the most beautiful squares in Paris, which is Place des Vosges, a royal square built by Henry IV of France. And this is where I'm taking you next. Ice cream. There's always a huge line at the ice cream parlors here in Paris, especially in the summer. There's a beautiful park at the center of this huge square that was designed in the 1600s. So technically, it's one of the most beautiful, as I said. Parisians think of it as a great example of the Baroque architecture in France and in Paris. And it's one of the oldest squares built by King Henry IV, again, so a royal square. It was also a real estate development, really, and today we call it, because those buildings, pavilions, we call them, those pavilions are apartment buildings, and they still are until now. The square is still very residential. Of course, the pavilions boast huge apartments with very tall ceilings, high ceilings inside those gorgeous apartments. They were the apartments for the wealthy families of the 1600s. Obviously, they remained pretty expensive. in terms of prices. And they're now the apartments for, again, wealthy families, wealthy people that decided to make the Marais their residence, or make the Place des Vosges their address. Madame de Sévigné, I told you about her, the one lady, the author, the writer, believed that the Musée Carnavalet was born into one of those pavilions. So you see, again, artistic life, intellectual life was going on here in the Marais. It was really the center of the intellectual life. Writers were in the Marais. They came to the salons of those wealthy families, those wealthy aristocratic families that were patrons to the artists and to the writers of the time. And they had those literary salons where those salons were actually gatherings of people, of intellectuals inside one's home. And they would, of course, spend the afternoon discussing about arts, about literature, about philosophy, and other subjects. There's a statue at the center of the Place des Vosges, reminding us of King Louis XIII. He was the son of King Henry IV. And a huge celebration, a party was thrown here to celebrate his wedding to a Spanish princess, Anne of Austria. Anne of Austria was sent from Spain to marry King or future King Louis XIII. And so again, the square was the ground, the playground for wealthy families coming from different parts of Europe and celebrate the wedding of two royals, the French king and the Spanish princess Anne of Austria that became the French queen. Now the name, the Place des Vosges, why? The name changed after the French Revolution. During the French Revolution, France abolished the monarchy, meaning that France dismissed the king, the royal family. They were in fact imprisoned and sentenced to death. And so the names of royal squares were changed. It was during Napoleon's time that the square took its name. The French government had said that the first, France had been divided into different districts. We call them départements in French. And so just so you know the story, but France, or the French government, sorry, said that the first département, newly created département district that pays the taxes that they owe to the French government, would see its name given to that square in the Marais in Paris. And the Vosges, which is still a département, a district in France, in eastern France, it's near Alsace, near Strasbourg. The Vosges département paid the taxes first and was, of course, given the opportunity, or was lucky enough to give its name to this beautiful, most beautiful square in Paris. The building that's facing, that you see straight ahead, is the King's Pavilion. And if I get closer, you need to look above the arch. And just above the central window, there's a medallion. In the pediment, just above the window, you see that architectural frame. It's sort of roundish, and it has a sort of oval medallion with a crown on it. And there's the portrait of Henry IV, who's the king that decided the construction of that square. Even though he didn't see it completed because he was assassinated in 1610. And the square was fully completed in 1612, at the beginning of 1610, so not long after he was assassinated or murdered by a lunatic. So the plaque reminds us of Madame de Sévigné, the French writer who was born here. There's galleries all around the square with shops, art galleries also. The square is famous for the art galleries, some restaurants as well, very old doors you can see in wood, carved.
Julien, I know you're taking us in the opposite direction, but maybe we could just mention in the other corner, you know, besides Sévigné, in the other corner we have the home.
You're right.
Probably one of the more famous French
You
writers, right? That we all know from Notre Dame and Hunchback.
I was thinking so much of Madame de Sévigné. I was so happy to, of course, say that.
Oh, I love that you're talking about Sévigné. Yes.
No, but she's not as famous. But I wanted to mention her because she was so important to the history of the Marais. But you're absolutely right. So I'm turning back into the direction of another house, which was inside one of those pavilions. And there's 36 pavilions in total. And in one of them, there's the house of, you're right, Ellen, the most famous writer in French history, was Victor Hugo, the one who wrote Les Miserables, and the one who also wrote Notre Dame, of course. And so Victor Hugo spent many years here on Place des Vosges. Many famous people actually came here. So not just Victor Hugo and Madame de Sévigné, but many famous people came here. Again, many wealthy families lived here. So obviously many artists, many writers came to the square, to the Place des Vosges. But Victor Hugo, and interestingly enough, the house was also restored, just like the Carnavalet Museum. It reopened a few months ago, just like the Carnavalet. It's a gorgeous house to tour. I really advise you if you're interested in Victor Hugo, or even if you're not interested in Victor Hugo, I'm sure you'll find the place fascinating because really it's a gorgeous house. It has all the original decor, some objects that Victor Hugo owned. So really a fantastic, smaller museum, sort of secret museum. It's away from the main tourist path, but it's really worth going. Spend an hour or two if you're in the Marais, if you're in Place des Vosges. Now I'm gonna take another secret door into, so we're just under one of those pavilions at one corner of the Place des Vosges, and we're in the garden of the Sully private mansion. So this is a gorgeous private mansion that was built in the 1630s for the Minister of Finance of King Henry IV. King Henry IV had died, obviously, he died. He was murdered again in 1610, but it was only 20 years later that his Minister of Finance, who was a pretty old man at the time, he commissioned the construction of that beautiful private mansion for his family. And so we are in one of the most beautiful mansions in the Marais, in a Baroque style, beautiful architecture. Of course, the Baroque style has a lot it was heavily influenced by the Renaissance. It's in continuity with the Renaissance. Hence the windows with the pediments and the scrolls and the floral motifs. A great sense of harmony. There's a great sense of symmetry, which is, of course, a rule in French architecture and even in French garden. You can see the garden is very symmetrical. There's the orange tree house, the orangerie, which is in the back there, which was common, especially in those grand private mansions. They would have, of course, many members of staff working in the mansion, in the kitchen, but also in the garden. And the conservatory was a way to preserve the orange trees and the lemon trees in the winter. They were preserved at a certain temperature. The rooms inside the orangery was kept at certain temperatures. And then, of course, the orange trees were taken out in the late spring and in the summer for people to enjoy a stroll among beautiful trees in the garden. There's also reference to mythology and allegories typical of the Renaissance and the Baroque as well. So if you look at the allegories here, or maybe I should, yes. Allegories of the spring with the woman holding the cornucopia, and allegory of summer with the woman to the right holding sheaves of wheat. The zodiac signs also, the one on top of the spring lady is the Ewe, the Aries in astrology, and the Cancer just above the woman for the summer, obviously, is the zodiac sign of the Cancer. So different references and symbols adorn the facade onto the garden, as well as the facade onto the main courtyard. When people came to visit Sully in his private mansion, they would come in a carriage. The carriage would park. So you see now it's actually a real parking lot with cars. You see cars parked, but back in the day, obviously you had carriages parked here in the main courtyard. And then you would get into the mansion, going through the main door, the gate of the mansion, the beautiful facade, beautiful decor. Two other figures here. It's interesting because, of course, the allegories of spring and summer face the garden, which makes sense. And here onto the courtyard, it's the allegories of fall and winter. The younger gentleman being fall with the grapes, and the older gentleman holding onto his cane is, of course, winter, with the zodiac signs of the Libra and Capricorn being zodiac signs of the fall and of the winter.
Julian, would you mind just pausing, just because you told us
Sure.
such an interesting story. I think when most of us are walking around Marais, we don't think of like how much work and effort it goes into sort of preserving these historic structures, right? And interestingly enough, the Hôtel de Sully, it's probably typical in how bad a state it was, right, prior to this 1960s Marais driven,
That's
so
right.
and now it has a real function, right, as it's the headquarter of all those national efforts, right?
Absolutely, very good question, Ellen. So you see, there's a great bookstore. It's a bookstore that specializes in art history and architecture. It has a beautiful, maybe I can get closer so you can have a look at the beautiful beams on the ceiling, because it has the original ceiling with the beams, and they are painted. So really something telling us about the beauty of the private mansion built in the 1630s. And why is that bookstore housed in the mansion? It's because, as you said, it's now a special commission. The commission that was started, that was initiated, or the project that was initiated by Malraux, is the Commission for National Monuments in France. And so basically they oversee the preservation of different monuments, national monuments all throughout France, not just in Paris. For Mont Saint-Michel is listed on the National Monuments Commission. It says here in French, Centre des Monuments Nationaux. So that's the commission. And so they run different very famous national monuments across the country. I'm thinking Saint Denis Basilica, where kings and queens of France are buried. I'm thinking the Mont Saint-Michel. I'm thinking the Sainte-Chapelle. The Sainte-Chapelle is run by the National Monuments Commission. So a really important commission for the preservation of historic monuments in the country.
Thank you for telling us about that, Julien. Just because, so many, Americans in particular, right? We sort of marvel at the historical wealth and richness of Paris, but it's nice to point out that doesn't happen by accident, right? There needs to be a real will and commitment to sort of the scholarship and the preservation, and of course the financing of all of that, right?
Absolutely, and France is a very centralized country. The importance of what we call the state here in France. It actually started with Louis XIV. Louis XIV is famous for saying back in the day, I am the state. As the king of France, I am the state. And so everything is very much centralized in the country, and everything needs to go through the scrutiny of commissions and government offices. And there's a whole part of the French government that deals with, or that runs culture in the country. We have a Ministry of Culture, a Secretary of Culture here in France. And it's really part of the French state, part of the French government, and there's funds given to that secretary, that ministry, to preserve and run all those museums and monuments. So next stop is a church. Of course, religious life was thriving in the Marais at a time when the church was extremely powerful. France was dubbed the elderly daughter of the church in the Middle Ages, and it remained a strong strongly Catholic until the French Revolution, and even after the French Revolution, well into the 19th century, until the separation of state and church in 1905 with the law. And so I want to show you, there's a band playing. I will stand in the sun, and I will turn back onto this most gorgeous church that we call Saint Paul, Saint Louis. And it's the mother house of the Jesuit congregation in France, or it used to be. The Jesuits moved to a different church on the left bank. Now their mother house is somewhere else in Paris. But when the Jesuits came to France, they settled in the Marais, and they rebuilt an old church, which was the Church of Saint Paul. They added the name Saint Louis in reference to that great king of France that became a saint after he died. He's right there on top. He's holding the crown of thorns because he's the one king that brought the crown of thorns back from Constantinople to Paris. The church is also, to tell you that so many people came to the church. The first stone of the church was laid by Cardinal Richelieu, who was a cardinal of the Catholic Church, who was also a prime minister for Louis XIII. And he laid the first stone of the church in 1627. And the church was very popular and famous all over Paris. For people in the Marais and even beyond the Marais, people would come to the Saint Paul Church to listen to great preachers. So it was basically almost like going to the movie theater. Today, people would go to Mass on Sunday at Saint Paul because they knew that they would listen to incredible preachers, the likes of Bossuet, and also obviously Jesuit priests and Jesuit preachers. They said that the sermons, the preach, was so long. Sometimes it could take 2 hours listening to those priests, and ladies were actually almost fainting, and they couldn't even go. They needed to go to the restroom and take some rest, but they couldn't because obviously you couldn't stop a priest, a preacher during his sermon, during his talk. So obviously, when we give the I want to show you different spots, and of course we have maybe 50 minutes together today, or let's say an hour. And so these are appetizers of the tour we're giving with Paris Muse. If you're interested, join us for the Marais stroll. Of course, we're taking our time. We go into further details. Of course, at Place des Vosges and Sully, the Sully mentioned. Saint Paul, Saint Louis, for those interested in religious art, we also go inside the church and see some of the details. It's also interesting in terms of history and see the role, the great role the Jesuit fathers played in the history of France and their relationship with royal power also. The Jesuit priests were the Society of Jesus, as the church calls it, was forbidden by French kings at some point in the 18th century. They were actually banned from France, and they had to go into exile before they were allowed to return in the 19th century.
And Julien, if I just may say so, I used to live just up the street from that church, and I love it so much. I also wanted to let people know when they're in Paris next, it's definitely worth going inside and two things that are just, I think, are so fascinating. There's actually a trace of revolutionary graffiti, yes, right, inside the church, where you see someone had written, République Française ou la mort, yes, French Republic or death. And I just think it's so fascinating that that's been left as a trace, right, of the absolutely history, yes, of this sort of complex damaged history between church and state in France, right?
Yeah, the fleur-de-lis were damaged. They were taken. They were actually removed, the fleur-de-lis, symbol of royal power. So yeah, there's traces of the conflicts between the church and the state in France all over French history. And so for that reason, the church is not interested, not just for religious art or religious history, but also for French history in general. Yeah, it's a great church for that.
There's also a beautiful Delacroix inside, right?
There's for those interested in
agony is just gorgeous. Yeah, that's kind of amazing.
Yeah, and different from other, yes, because Delacroix, it's a special thoughts on religion. So it's worth going see the Delacroix, yes, the Christ at Gethsemane, at the Garden of Gethsemane. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we're just behind. The convent was turned into a prestigious high school. Well, prestigious. I know it sounds funny because it's a public high school, but some high schools in Paris are more prestigious than others because there's so many thinkers or writers that went and studied in certain high schools. And Charlemagne, it's named after a king in the Middle Ages, or an emperor, I should say. Lycée Charlemagne is one of those high schools that parents are trying to send their kids to because obviously it plays a great part of a person's resume here in France, showing what high school you went to, or obviously also the schools, the grand schools, as we call them, the colleges, what you call the colleges in America. So we call them grand schools here in France. And so it plays a great role in the prestige of someone's resume for a future career. There's a reminder no, not a remainder. There's something left, a remnant of the wall that was built by King Philip August, which is, you see that wall that looks like it's in a very bad state. It is, in fact, because it's very old. It's more than 800 years old. It was built by King Philip August, and it's a wall that was built to preserve Paris from invasions. In the Middle Ages, of course, the country was at war with many other people. The people of the time that wanted to come to Paris and take Paris, the Vikings, the Normans, as we call them, because they took the region Normandy. The name Normandy comes from the Norsemen becoming the Normans, the Vikings, coming from Northern Europe. And that wall was built to protect Paris because Philip August was actually busy fighting wars all of his life. So as he left Paris, he thought that he needed to protect the city with the construction of that wall. And interestingly enough, I talked about the Louvre. The Louvre started as a fortress. It was a medieval stronghold in the first place, built by Philip August, and it was part of that wall, basically. It took some time before the Louvre became a royal palace, a royal residence, and then it was transformed into a beautiful Renaissance palace by King Henry II. But in the very beginning, the Louvre had a strategic function as a military stronghold for French kings.
Julien, we often go, as you know, our family tour, Time to Explore Paris, goes through this neighborhood, and
yes, good.
Families, we often sort of chuckle because kids in that park that you just showed us are often playing, like kickball against this
That's
wall
right,
from 1190, right? Just to sort of as a sign of how deeply integrated history is into sort of just everyday life, right? There's no cordoning off, don't touch this wall. It's just kind of part of everyday kids' activities.
Part of everyday life. Absolutely, yes. They play basketball a lot. They have a basketball playground just behind the high school. Yeah, you're right, absolutely. It's funny because, yes, the Marais is still alive with people who come here, again, as I said, for shopping, for dining, for hanging out with friends. And so it's still a very lively neighborhood in Paris, even though it's so old, full of history, and full of those old monuments. I will make a turn left because there's another mansion I want to show you, which is different in the way that it's a very old mansion, and it's a testimony of the medieval Marais, when religious congregations were going strong before moving to the left bank. It's really the left bank which is associated. So when I'm talking the left bank, I'm talking about the southern part of the city, south of the river. And it's the left bank that was long associated with religious life, many convents and abbeys. Still standing today, I'm thinking Saint-Germain-des-Prés, which used to be a huge abbey. It's not anymore now. It's not been since the French Revolution. It's a religious private mansion. It's funny because it's no church. It's built in the late Gothic style, and it's the Hôtel de Sens. It's a real jewel. It's also a library. It's a library specializing in art history. So you see, it's all about history and art history really here in the Marais. And so Hôtel de Sens is the private mansion where the Archbishop of Sens would stay in Paris. As he stayed in Paris, he would stay here. Who was the Archbishop of Sens? He was the most powerful archbishop in the kingdom in the Middle Ages. For different reasons, he was more powerful than the Archbishop of Paris. And in fact, at some point, the Archbishopric of Paris was submitted to the Archbishopric of Sens. And that's why the Sens Archbishop, which is a town in Burgundy, it's a small city now, really. But in the Middle Ages, it was a very important city, especially because of the prestige of the cathedral there. And so the archbishops of Sens had that private mansion where they could stay when they were in Paris, and it was turned into a library. Again, as I said, there's a very pretty garden, as you see. The flowers are in full bloom, beautiful trees. So it's also a place where Parisians love to hang out, to see people with books. It's a great place for reading, getting some rest before exploring more of the neighborhood. And before getting to Ile Saint-Louis, my next stop and final stop. So we'll be crossing the River Seine. It's funny because the Ile Saint-Louis is an artificial island. It used to be two different islands. It used to be Notre Dame Island and Cow Island. Those islands were actually pastures. Cow Island, it's actually true that there were cows on those two islands. At some point, it was at the beginning of the 1600s that they decided to merge the two islands, filling the gap between the two islands, create an artificial island, create land basically, expand the neighborhood, the Marais neighborhood, to the south onto the river, and build beautiful private mansions, so that wealthy families, again, more families could move into the area, into that part of the capital of France. The Ile Saint-Louis is the part of Paris that has the most ancient buildings in the city. So it's really a preserved area, and it is also for long. I need to check now because things change with the COVID pandemic in terms of real estate. Well, it didn't change dramatically, but just for long, for many years, the Ile Saint-Louis was the most expensive place to live in Paris. It was the highest real estate prices in the capital for more than 20 years. And I think it still is the case now.
So Julien, without throwing your phone in the Seine, do you want to just show us a little bit? Because you're crossing over, which I know is it's an everyday activity for you, Julien, but crossing the Seine is breathtaking for all of us who can't be there.
Sorry.
No, wonderful. Hold on a second, so beautiful.
No, I will wait for my green light for pedestrians. I will cross over because we can see the roofs of the city hall. Because the city hall is
beautiful.
I can only show you a tiny part of the Marais. It's funny because it's not a huge neighborhood. It's two arrondissements and small districts in Paris out of 20, but it's pretty big still. You could spend, as I said, you could spend a few days without leaving the Marais. You could spend a few days in Paris and stay in the Marais and not see it all. If I walk the other direction, I would go to the city. I would get to the city hall. The huge roofs that you see them sticking out above the green trees. That's the city hall. And their scaffoldings is for another church. That's another beauty, Saint-Gervais. Saint-Gervais is another gorgeous church, but it's more Renaissance. That's another story. We'll also go there during the Marais tour with Paris Muse. We go to Saint-Gervais. We go to the city hall. There's a lot of history also that we share with you on the tour, because there's a statue of Etienne Marcel. Before the French Revolution, there were other episodes of rebellions, uprising in France. France is the country of uprisings, of riots, and of revolutions. And so there were many all throughout French history, not just the Great Revolution of 1789. So there's a lot more to find out on the tour in the Marais. But of course, that's a different part of the Marais. I wanted to take you to Ile Saint-Louis. Ile Saint-Louis is fantastic because it's quieter. It has this beautiful banks. So basically, people at the time, because there was only one bridge, the bridge that you see over there. There was only one bridge at the time the island was artificially created. And so people would actually, you see rings, metal rings along the bank. People would get to their mansion with boats. They would the access to the mansions were actually not so low as it is now. These are works of the 20th century because of the rise of the river rises now. So just to make it more secure, safe, they had to create that gap, that depth between the mansions to the left and the river to the right. But back then, yes, the access was made easier. And so the banks are lined with those beautiful private mansions. And the most beautiful mansion of them all is the one I want to take you to now. It's the best kept secret of Ile Saint-Louis, because it's the only private mansion open to the public. And it's not open to the public every day. It's kind of difficult to get to Lauzun. Hold on a second. Yes, Ellen, tell me.
Why don't you probably have to pay attention while you're crossing the street, Julia.
Yeah,
We don't want you to get hit just because you're sharing your knowledge with us. That would be too much of a sacrifice for Paris Muse, Julien.
Yeah, it's a wide boulevard here, so people tend to drive faster on that bridge.
I just have to tell everyone, I mean, we're really looking forward, obviously, to this in-person tour that you're planning of the Hôtel de Lauzun. But we've been posting sort of photographs of the interior, and so if you're not following us, either on Facebook or Instagram, that's kind of where we're sharing news about tours that we're working on. And the Hôtel de Lauzun tour is going to be on a set date. Julien, and I and Vera still have to work out all the details, but we're really looking forward to one of the good things about this pandemic and this kind of slow year for us has been that we're all kind of excited to do new things, right? Julien, we're sort of like, obviously the Louvre and the Orsay is always going to be places where we take people, but I feel like a lot of us have kind of come up with some new concepts and new ideas to keep us learning in this quiet period. So I'm really excited, Julien, and really looking forward to this Hôtel de Lauzun tour. And while I have our 40 people who are with us today, we have taken a sort of brief hiatus from doing digital online tours, classes, workshops. But if there's anything that you would like to see, we're really going to try to integrate our kind of, take what we learned from online teaching and touring and try to combine it with our live in-person tours more effectively to prepare people, to get them excited about what they can see and what they want to see when they arrive in Paris. So Vera and I are totally open if anyone has suggestions of the kinds of online programs that you would be really interested in attending and hearing more about, to get you excited and to get you prepared. So much about traveling in Paris, of course, is how to make the best use of your time, right? Like, what are things that I want to see? What are things that I want to revisit with a more kind of in-depth exploration? And that's what we're here for. So we're all ears if you'd like to share suggestions, because we are busily getting ready for launching online programs in the fall, as well as we continue to do our in-person live tours. And so, Julien, you're going to tell us about the Hôtel Lauzun, but I also wanted to remind all of our guests here that if you have any questions for Julien, feel free to put them in the chat.
Sure.
And I will
just say a few
repeat
words.
them to Julien. But Julien, why don't you tell us a little bit about where you are?
Yeah, just a few words about the Hôtel de Lauzun. So we want to start this. We are creating Ellen, this tour on the Hôtel de Lauzun. So the tour will be, obviously, we'll have a walk on Ile Saint-Louis because we really want to tell the history of this island and this particular history of creating a new piece of land here in the center of Paris, and basically building those new private mansions on that newly created island. Now, on top of that, the private mansion is, I think it's one of the best mansions, one of the most beautiful mansions for two reasons. First, the decor is the best preserved decor of 17th century in Paris. It's absolutely gorgeous. You need to see it for your own eyes. It has all those rooms designed in the 17th century, in the 1630s and in the 1640s. The mansion was built for a man. The second reason I'm going to tell you now, the second reason I think the mansion is super interesting is that the people who lived in there had fascinating lives. Not all of them, but I'd say the three families that resided in that mansion had fascinating lives that we will share with you when you come for in-person tours in Paris at the Lauzun Hotel. The first who commissioned the one man that commissioned the construction is Charles Bruin. He has a funny name because Bruin in French means snout in English. So he chose the wild boar to be his emblem on his coat of arms because he felt a little shameful about his last name, Bruin, meaning snout. But anyway, he was in love with a very wealthy woman, so he actually married her so he could partially finance the construction of his private mansion. Even though he came from a family with low extraction, but his father made a fortune running a cabaret on the city island next to Notre Dame Cathedral. And the second resident that had a fascinating life, who was actually the owner of the mansion for only a couple of years, is the man who gave his name to the private mansion. He's Lauzun, and Lauzun was a duke. He was a noble, but he was from low nobility, and he made his way up the social ladder, up all the way up to the king, the Sun King, Louis XIV. Even more than that, he managed to make the wealthiest woman in the kingdom at the time fall in love with him. She was Louis XIV's cousin. She was Mary Louise of Orleans, and she was, they would call her the Grand Mademoiselle, the Grand Miss, because she was a cousin to Louis XIV, but she was descending Gaston d'Orléans, he was the brother of Louis XIII, and the family of Gaston d'Orléans was one of the wealthiest families in the kingdom. And this lady, Anne-Marie Louise, was at the time of Louis XIV, she was the wealthiest person. Lauzun was in love with her. She was in love with him. They secretly married because, of course, Louis XIV at some point, Louis XIV first agreed on the marriage, but then stepped back. I mean, he changed his mind and he forbade the wedding between his cousin and between the Duc de Lauzun for different reasons. The court played against the couple. But of course, what I will do, I could spend a half an hour telling you the long story of that man who then moved to England and worked for the King of England at some point in his life before he returned to France. They also said that Anne-Marie Louise came secretly to visit him here on Ile Saint-Louis, but she was wearing a long cape and she was hiding her face. She was using a boat, and then she would step out of the boat and climb the few steps to get in secret into the private mansion to meet with a lover. So there's a lot of great stories to share in the mansion. Last character that is worth mentioning is Charles Baudelaire, a very famous poet of the 19th century in France. He spent some time here. He lived a few years. He spent some time with a group of artists, a group of thinkers, a group of writers, and a group of artists. He would rent a room in the upper floors. He actually rented a room just under the roofs here at the Lauzun mansion. So many very special and different characters worth sharing their biography, their story, and their life, really.
And Julien, since you've been speaking of literature, I believe that's where Charles Baudelaire wrote his Fleur du Mal. Maybe,
that's right.
Maybe under the influence, since they
under the influence, because
yes.
The place was also unfamous for that group of artists that I mentioned with you. Their name was the Club of the Assassins because they would basically smoke what we now call marijuana. And so it was the very beginning of because of course, obviously, the plane came from countries in Northern Africa, the Levant, the Orient, as we call it here in France. And so they were among the first artists to try new substances. And so they would do so here in the Lauzun mansion, among other artists and other writers. And Charles Baudelaire was involved in that group. Yeah.
I would say then, Julien, it's a great place to kind of conclude your tour because the building itself points to this fascinating mixture between, the history of the elites, aristocracy, but also that kind of bohemian and quirky side
Absolutely.
of, you know, taking chances and writing avant-garde literature, you know, and for me, the Marais neighborhood that you showed us is all that, right? It sort of tells these multiple sides of French history. And so
Absolutely.
I know many of you have your own kind of, you know, interests in Paris, but, you know, Julien was so thorough and kind of touched on, you know, the way that the Marais tells us about the history of the aristocracy in France, but also it's such a rich center for, you know, Jewish history. It's such a rich center for LGBTQ history, right? I mean, it's so many different communities.
That's right. That's another part of the Marais again. And we go to all those places in the Marais tour, in the Paris Muse Marais tour, the Jewish area, the Jewish neighborhood, and of course, other communities that settled all throughout the history of the neighborhood. So we get to see that. It's obviously I had to make choices so that I could get to Lausanne in the end.
Of course,
since we're launching the tour. But of course, you're right, Ellen. There are so many people, not just the aristocracy, but obviously so many other people in other communities settled in the Marais and made this neighborhood maybe the most vibrant in Paris, in France.
Thank you so much, Julien, because you know you brought it back for me. I used to live on the Rue Petit Musc, right? So you know I used to take my kids to that beautiful little garden you showed us at the hotel, in the back of the Hôtel du Sens. Which, for those of you who are in the Marais, it's such a quiet place to have a sandwich.
Oh, it's beautiful there.
It's amazing. It's really, thank you so much, Julien.
Final word about Hôtel de Lauzun. It's interesting because it's now the campus for an institute. It's the Institute for Advanced Studies, and it's modeled after the Institute for Advanced Studies of Princeton in New Jersey, Princeton University in New Jersey. And it's actually a campus that's that allows students, PhD students, to spend the amount of time they need to work on their thesis. So really, it's also a special place for studies, and again, a part of the intellectual life of the area.
Julien, you and I and Vera will have to keep studying, because having a fellowship there is really a rare treat. You get to just, you know, spend time in the libraries and not have to teach. So we'll have to keep studying in order to get in there.
Good.
Thank you, everyone. Does everyone have any final questions or comments?
Yes, please.
For
let me take a couple of questions, maybe.
As you know, we've been, Vera has been very helpfully supporting everything you say, Julien, with links and so that we can see, you know, it's always really helpful, right, for non-French speakers to actually also see the words that you are, all the names of the places to help us remember some of these spots that we want to go back to. Lauzun, yeah.
I know it's a hard one, this one.
But right now it's all just thank yous in the commentaries.
My
Julien.
pleasure.
And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Please stay tuned. As I said, we'll be back in September. We're also having another free meetup in September on a slightly different topic, which is art and mindfulness, and some strategies for kind of using art to achieve a sort of, you know, restful, like peaceful mental state. A lot of us, when we go to Paris or any other city, you know, there's so much to see, as Julien has proven today, that we often, you know, revert to a very kind of almost frantic, manic pace. So we're having a great talk with someone who's an art historian and runs a meditation and yoga studio, one of our other guides and instructors, Pamela Warner, in September. So I hope you'll come back and join us for that. And I know Julien will have some other ideas for events that we can all do together as he continues his very busy life of giving live tours for Paris Muse. So I want to wish everybody a great rest of the weekend. Julien, we'll see you soon. Thanks again. Merci.
Thank you. Merci.
Bon weekend. Bon weekend.
Bon weekend. À bientôt.
Ciao.
Au revoir.